Now time for the panel portion. We will be going into panel 1, which is defending forward in industrial control systems. Our moderator is Jamil Jaffer, who currently serves as the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute and an assistant professor of law and director of the National Security Law and Policy Program at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, where he teaches classes on counterterrorism, intelligence, surveillance, cybersecurity, and other national security matters, as well as a summer course in Padua, Italy, waiting for my invite, Jamil, with U.S. Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. Jaffer is also affiliated with Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation and previously served as a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution from 2016 to 2019. He holds degrees from UCLA, the University of Chicago Law School, and the United States Naval War College. He and his panel should be with us shortly. His panelists include Dave Weinstein, Marie O'Neill Skironi, and Vishal Hariprasad. I'm interested in this panel because I think this is one of those challenging questions on when we look at critical infrastructure, of course, being something that supports modern society. We're primarily talking about civilians. And so it's going to be interesting to hear their perspectives on how do we balance the ethics and morality of industrial control systems with our own nation state protection, as well as influencing and deterring adversaries who might wish us harm. I see that the panelists have joined us in the room. I cannot believe I'm more dressed up than you are, Jamil.
It is a rarity, but it is true. I have a sport coat I could put on if it would make you feel better.
It would warm the cockles of my heart.
Would it? All right, I'll go get my sport coat then. All right. Never say I don't do anything for you. Look at V8's already in his suit, so, and in his jacket at least, so he was well briefed.
I get a favor a year.
I love the matching orange tie and the boutonniere. I mean, look at that guy is stylish.
It happens.
All
I can't
right.
remember the last time I wore a tie. All right, we are still waiting for Dave and Marie to join. I see Dave in there. He's coming online. I see his webcam is turned on, but we don't see him.
Hey guys, I'm in here.
We hear you, but we don't see you.
Interesting. I don't see any of you all either.
At least it's mutual.
Here we go.
There we go. I see your webcam coming back on, and there's Dave, sporting the Jamil Jaffer look of a minute ago.
I went and got a sport coat, Dave. Just so you know, I was told to obtain a sport coat.
I heard that commentary. I just couldn't see anything.
There you go.
All right, we're still waiting for Marie. Was she in the green room with y'all?
She was. So we know she's available.
Well, why don't I hand it over to you and you can start introducing your panelists, and hopefully by that time, Marie will have joined.
Yeah, sounds great. So listen, thanks to Bryson and ICS Village and R Street, NSI Cyberbytes for hosting us today. I'm Jamil Jaffer. I'm the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute, and we're super thrilled to be working with the team to present today's Hack the Capitol. I'm really excited about the panel we have today. We've got Vishal V8 Hariprasad. V8 co-founded Resilience in 2016 to bridge the divide between cyber insurance and cybersecurity. He's a licensed insurance broker and producer, a veteran of the U.S. Air Force and the cybersecurity industry. And he brings a wide range of leadership skills, particularly the ones that he honed when he was at the National Security Agency, to his position as the CEO of Resilience. Dave Weinstein is an associate partner at McKinsey & Company, where he specializes in cybersecurity. Prior to McKinsey, he was the chief security officer at Clarity, an industrial cybersecurity startup. Dave's government experience includes serving both as the chief technology officer and the chief information security officer for the state of New Jersey. And Neil Shironi is the CEO of Tribal Tech and its subsidiary Cowan & Associates. Neil is an executive leader and successful entrepreneur with over 2 decades of public and private sector technology, defense, and national security experience. She's the co-founder and president of Trinity Cyber, previously served as a senior executive at BAE Systems, and served alongside me in the White House under President George W. Bush, where she was senior director for cybersecurity. So we're thrilled to have this awesome panel here with us today. And I know that Neil will be joining us here in just a second. But why don't we just go ahead and get started right at the top. And so, look, we're talking today about defending forward and industrial control systems. Is that even a thing, right? And so, Dave, I want to start with you. We've been talking about threats in the ICS environment for a long time now. What's changed fundamentally, if anything, in this moment? And why are we even talking about defending forward in the ICS environment at this time?
Yeah, sure. So there's kind of a couple major trends that we're seeing in talking with large companies with significant industrial footprints. And some of this dates back to my time at Clarity, where I was actually spending time with plant managers, with the industrial engineers who are charged with operating these systems. The first major trend, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in great detail, is IT-OT convergence, right? The notion that industrial control systems, which have long existed in an almost entirely isolated state, are now both more interconnected within the OT environment and in some cases connected to the IT environment, right? And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. There's pretty legitimate business mandates that are pushing the need for bringing data from the shop floor to the top floor, so to speak, and making sure that the executives as well as business representatives are able to glean in real time what's happening within the industrial environment. The other aspect that has affected this trend is COVID. There's always been a level of remote access that's been necessary for most OT networks, most industrial control systems. But obviously, in the age of COVID, that need has only increased. So that's kind of what's happening.
Because people are remote and they're having to access these systems from afar. They just can't come into the factory floor or the power plant or whatever it might be.
Yeah, they can't be there physically, right? Yeah. And there's always been use cases for remote access, but they've been relatively few and far between. And COVID has made them much more common. And what that does, obviously, is it opens up new attack vectors for actors. And I think that the second trend that we're noticing in this space, the first trend is IT-OT convergence. The second trend, and it's related, is that the level of sophistication necessary to access and potentially attack these networks is decreasing. No longer do nation states monopolize the ICS threat landscape. The barriers to entry, in effect, have fallen, and that's creating challenges for owners and operators of this infrastructure.
Yeah. So Neil, we were just talking to Dave, and Dave, we were talking about what sort of changed in the industry at this point, and why are we talking about defend forward and ICS at this time? What's sort of fundamentally new? Dave was telling us about, obviously the COVID, the pivot to COVID, the increased capabilities that we see attackers having, and the like. And I just want to update you on what we were talking about. I'm going to go over to V8 and let him weigh in first, and then come over to you, Neil, so you have a chance to catch your breath as you get into the environment. But V8, so thoughts on what Dave said? Do you think he's right that the environment has fundamentally changed because of COVID, or at least acceleration of trends we were already seeing, and obviously the IT-OT convergence that Dave talked about? That's obviously been a long-standing trend. But are there any other sort of really, and this expansion of more nation-state capabilities in the hands of the average individual or a broader group of people at least? I mean, those all seem like things that we could have said a year ago, other than COVID, to be fair. But the trend that Dave points out is really sort of in play before COVID happened. It's definitely accelerated. What other things do you see going on in the environment that makes us sort of more concerned today about ICS, and why we might think about the government getting more aggressive, or whomever getting more aggressive and playing in this defend forward space? We should also define, by the way, defend forward here in just a second. But V8, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll just double click on everything that Dave said. It's more of an acceleration of trends that we were already noticing. A couple of key points, even before COVID, one of the major ICS security vendors noted, 40% of all industrial sites have at least one public-facing internet connection, and at least 84% of those have some remote access asset in that network. That's only further accelerated, exactly as Dave said, because of COVID. In order to continue production operations from home or from remote environments, it's proliferated that, and it's added on the access via VPN and other known attack vectors that we've seen live across multiple other types of networks in the past year. Now, one of the interesting parts that I will also point out is an acceleration in the awareness of ICS and OT risks. You can just see the amount of certifications. And a decade ago, when I was starting out in this industry, you didn't really know what ICS. It was a very small group of folks that spoke about ICS and SCADA. Now you can go to a couple of major training sites. SANS has a couple of great courses, 3 or 4 different courses that start you from SCADA fundamentals and go all the way up to advanced, right? I mean, there's now a larger corpus of folks that even if you're not in the OT space, you can get training and awareness of all the various factors and assets associated with ICS and OT attacks. And I kind of think the other thing that I really want to highlight is that convergence that Dave mentioned about ICS and OT with IT. The recent spate of ransomware attacks that we've seen has only highlighted this. I think just 2 months ago, the second largest packaging manufacturer in the country, in the US, was taken down, had OT ramifications, business interruption losses, because of a ransomware attack on their IT networks. But in a lot of the articles that you might be able to read about them, it all comes down to, it wasn't so much about the ransom as much as it was around their inability to get the job done for that time that they were down. And, a lot of articles I read, I don't have the details, but it goes into the fact that they had OT disruptions because of a ransomware event. And looking at the ransomware families, we know there's no specific ICS code or ICS targeted code in that. So the convergence is real and it's accelerating along with the future of technology.
One point just to pick up on that is, the notion of an ICS attack has become much more tangible and real to the average owner and operator versus, 5-10 years ago when the only ICS networks that were being targeted were, nuclear plants and defense facilities, etc. Now it's hitting, as V8 said, CPG companies, right? Or, water utilities. And as we saw in the Oldsmar attack in Florida, it didn't take a whole lot. It didn't take, the vast resources of state-sponsored actors to be able to gain access to an engineering workstation and increase the amounts of sodium hydroxide in the water by 100 times. So I think that kind of tangible reality is setting in, and that's driving the level of awareness that V8's talking about.
Yeah. So Neil.
I was just
go ahead, please.
Because I would say my take is, except for acceleration, I describe it as what's old is new again. Right. And so for me, this seems to be a conversation we've been having for quite a while. And being kind of the person who likes to stir the pot, let me stir it a little bit with Dave's.
Right.
We saw back in 1982 an attack on the Trans-Siberian oil infrastructure, right? Allegedly. You have Sands Casino. You have the Northeast power grid issue that occurred in 2003. We have the Russian attack on the Ukrainian electric grid in 2015. We've had multiple events that have occurred. Look at all the research Mike Asante did back in 2008 over at the Idaho National Labs on the use of a relay to impact large power generation. We've seen this. We've seen the impact. We've talked about it. And yet we're still here today having in many ways the same conversation. And so my question, the threat has been there. The willingness to use it by nation states has been there. We've been talking about it. I think the change, Jamil, to your point, is the acceleration of it. And to both of your points, people for the first time, I think, care about it as to how it impacts them directly. And so, Dave, to your point, this is more real, right? But it's not new. And so I think we have to take a really critical look at, okay, so how are we going to make this different? So what will our reaction be that will get something that is beneficial?
So Neil, so on that point, a lot of people have been saying there are different points of view about NSA and Cyber Command's new defend forward approach, right? Laid out in the 2018 NDAA, sorry, the 2018 National Defense Strategy, and then the commander's intent for Cyber Command. It lays out this idea that we are going to directly engage the enemy overseas in their systems. We're going to attempt to disrupt and degrade their ability to conduct attacks here in the United States, and that we're going to consistently do that, not just once in a while, but we're going to persistently engage them, right? We're going to be constantly in contact with the adversary in their environments overseas, with the hopes that we stop a threat before it hits our shores. So that's the working theory, at least as I understand it, on defend forward, persistent engagement, all these allegedly new concepts. Neil, you and I were talking about these things, or we're discussing these things again back a decade ago when we were in the White House, working with NSA and cyber and the beginnings of what became Cyber Command, JFCC, and W. But is that a real theory when it comes to, so we got that theory in the IT space, it's working. You could debate whether it's working or it's not working, and we've had those debates. We can have those debates here today, and maybe we should. But does it work? Can it work in the ICS space? Should we be applying defend forward in that space? What are the risks or concerns, Neil, in your mind, if we take sort of this quote unquote new approach in the ICS environment?
Okay, that is a huge question, all rolled into something that seems simple, but let me start to unpack it in little pieces.
Right.
And then I am certain my panelists, friends, will also engage on all of this. First, I'll take the piece around defend forward, right? Yeah. And in concept, you described it, as I understand it, exactly correct, right? But
I hear a caveat coming though.
Yeah, as with all good policy pieces, the devil's in the details, right? So you start to work through what that means. So what does it mean to engage, and how do we define it as an enemy? And how do we understand intent, right? So when is being in a network pre-operational planning versus when is it espionage versus when is it a criminal event? And how do you know the difference? Do we clearly understand their intent? As part of this, what is our deterrent strategy? So what is our red line? What actions are we going to allow, and what actions are we not going to allow? And those questions are the meaty policy questions in cyber that folks tend not to want to discuss. So,
well, look, I love that. I love those issues. No, keep going, Neil. Keep going. I didn't mean to cut you off, please.
So I would say, look, that applies across the board, whether you're talking about defend forward in traditional IT, or whether you're talking about defend forward in OT, or ICS for that matter, right? And let me also start by saying, until we're consistent in how we talk about these pieces and clearly define them, I may be talking about one thing, and Dave and Vishal may be talking about something totally different. So we're also inconsistent in how we use the phrase IT, OT, ICS, etc. But put that also aside.
Yeah.
I think that one of the big challenges of defend forward is the discussion of risk and reward, intel loss and intel gain. It always comes back to that at the end of the day when you're working in a national security environment. And I think that the ICS environment, because it is physical and because it is infrastructure, and because there are a limited number of suppliers, and Dave and Vishal, I will tee that up and turn it over to you. I know you both have strong opinions on both of those fronts. It creates a new unique question around the impact if you decide to defend forward, right? Yeah. What happens? We rely on that same infrastructure, and more importantly, the private sector and the citizens rely on that infrastructure. So what does it mean to defend forward within that infrastructure? And what are the unknown consequences of those actions? Be careful what you decide to do, because it comes back at you. This isn't traditional warfare where you shoot a bullet and you know when it's gone. This one's going to ricochet back at you in a vulnerability or in an attack back.
Well, so let's talk about that. So V8, so you served at the NSA and on some of these cyber activities. You're now running a company that does insurance in this space. And so you're going to approach from two very different perspectives, but I think both which relate to the things that Neil was just talking about, right? The risk-reward calculus, the understanding of what it means for the enemy to be acting in our environments. How do we tell the difference between when they're conducting espionage and going further? We had a very real experience with this just now in SolarWinds. Some people referred to it as, Senator Schumer referred to it on the floor as a massive, cyber attack that required an offensive response, right? Other folks said this is just high-end espionage, right? How do we think about these attacks or these hacks or whatever you want to call them, right? And the capabilities that our adversaries have, and then how do we think about how to deter them? To Neil's point, right? Is defend forward a sensible way to deter? And I do want to talk about the ICS space in particular. Do we create more risk or reduce risk if we're applying the defend forward approach in the ICS space relative to the larger IT environment? Thoughts?
So, first off, Neil, you added a lot of great grenades there and just tossed it over to Dave and I. So thank you for that. But no, all completely great points, right? We have a lack of appropriate lexicon, and the red lines are just not defined any which way. Jamil, to your question, I've been fortunate enough to be at the operational level for both Title 10 and Title 50 prior to my civilian life. But one of the things,
what that means, though, just in case they don't know, Vishal, what is Title 10? What's Title 50?
The difference between espionage or national intelligence authorities and military/attack authorities. So
right. Title 50 being intelligence, Title 10 being offensive authorities, military.
So, as Jamil referenced earlier, JFCCNW, I was back there with a different colored badge, so I was on the opposite side of that, and now I have a different badge. So your color badge actually also dictates whether or not you understand certain lexicons and red lines accordingly. And they're not even within our own government, not necessarily all aligned at the same time, not on purpose, but just because of how large and complex this topic is. The other key aspect, though, that was really fascinating for me when I left the government space, I'm still a reservist, but when I went to the civilian sector, joined Palo Alto Networks with my IT cybersecurity company, was the fact that a lot of US entities, persons, companies, they can only see all the way up to their network perimeter. So they're focused entirely on the operations of their business, not about anything beyond their perimeter. One, they can't see it, and two, cyber threat intelligence wasn't a big thing back then, and even then it's still very esoteric. It's not something you really concern yourself with. So in the Title 10, Title 50 government world, we talk about intel gain loss, we talk about all these operational effects, but then the end users, the operators of these networks, they're just trying to get their job done, right? They're just trying to execute on a day-to-day basis. The interesting fact here is, as it comes to this convergence of whether the government needs to figure out exactly how we want to operate and when and where, but at the end of the day, all of these infrastructures that we're talking about, with the exception of very select few, the vast majority of them are handled by the civilian right. Companies, right? And so we have to keep in mind that intel gain loss doesn't really mean much to them as long as they can stay up. And as I think about defend forward, and it's still a relatively new concept as I am coming to grips with it, but I will say this, regardless of what the impact is, whether it's an IT network, an OT network, I mean, we saw what happened in the UK with the healthcare systems going down a year ago with
right.
those attacks, right? I mean, these issues, if we are not in these networks, or if we're not actually actively engaging at them, the adversaries absolutely will. And to your point, Jamil, hafnium, SolarWinds, regardless of whether it's espionage or attack or opportunistic, we already know the adversaries, whether it's nation state or other, crimeware or other, are in these networks. So, I'll pose this question to the group, and I know Dave probably has an opinion here. What's the difference? So should we continue to be naive about it, or get in there and be eyes wide open?
Yeah.
Well, I do want to come. Yeah. Well, Dave, before I get to you, I just want to go back to the deal for 1 second. So, Neil, I am interested in your sort of thoughts on V8's point that, look, the government's got to decide what's it going to do here, what's it going to do defensively, what's it going to do offensively to push back, and then let folks know, work with industry, because they own 90% of these networks and systems, perhaps even more so in the OT space than in the IT space, which already we know is above 90%. I mean, why can't the government seem to get their story straight, figure out what their deterrence plan is, their deterrence policy is, and figure out what their defensive plan is? Because it does seem crazy that we expect every company in the environment, from the most critical infrastructure companies to mom and pop shops, to defend against everybody that comes at them, whether it's a small individual hacker in their basement all the way to a nation state. It seems crazy on the defensive side, and everyone's not sure what they're allowed to or supposed to on the offensive side, and the government doesn't have a deterrence policy. Why can't they get this figured out? And is the cyber EO that's coming out going to solve any of this?
Okay, so again, huge question. And Dave, I'm sorry, because I'm going to jump in on this and then I will hand it over to you.
Go for it.
Jamil, I think there's a lot of issues about why the government can't get sort of their piece together, right? One of the issues is how many people are responsible for it. And I like to say that when everyone has a role, no one has a role. And when everyone's responsible, no one's responsible, period. And that's part of the problem, right?
But Neil, the Biden administration created a deputy national security advisor. They have a national cyber director. They've nominated somebody for CISA. They've got a great head. I mean, they have the A team. I mean, they've got Jen Easterly, right? Ann Neuberger, right? I mean, Rob Joyce. I mean, it's a who's who.
People who've been involved in it for ages, right?
Chris Inglis.
Yep. So, but the difference is when you actually have to take action, right? So at the end of the day, the government isn't the person that controls the infrastructure, it's the private sector company. And if you want the private sector company to do something, back to Vishal's point, you have to give them actionable information. What do you want me to do? Why do you want me to do it? How will it impact me? And you have to understand how it will impact them, right? And so as a private sector entity, you look at it and you say, my IT is a cost center. Is a cost center, right? And you've got to speak the language of business. And one of the problems of government is we don't speak the language of business, and we don't do a good job explaining what I need you to do, why I need you to do it, and appreciating the impact that that will have on industry and on business, right? That's the key.
Great point. It's a great point.
So that piece needs to happen as part of this larger discussion. Do I think we have the A team? We have people that have been involved in this for years, right? They've learned the lessons. They've seen this. They've seen what we've tried to do. My challenge would be, okay, so you've seen what hasn't worked. So let's try something different, because more of the same. So we're still talking about sharing information. That's great. You're going to share information with me. Is that information going to tell me what I need to do? Is it going to be actionable? Because if it's not, that doesn't help me. It's great, we've now shared, but to what end?
Yeah. So Dave, you've been on the receiving end of this stuff, right? As the former CISO of New Jersey, and then trying to help companies and states dealing with this at Clarity, now consulting with all those things at McKinsey. I mean, where do you come at this from? I mean, how do you see what the government is doing right, what the government's not doing right, and are you worried about sort of the increased risk if we do decide to sort of do defend forward and apply it in the ICS, or at least as the ICS threats in our enemy environments? Does it raise the ICS risk calculus here in the U.S.?
Yeah. So if there's one thing I've learned in navigating both IT and OT security is that it is risky, to say the least, to apply IT strategies to the OT environment, right? So when I hear defend forward for ICS, defend forward being something that was designed, primarily for IT environments, I get a little nervous because I worry that it doesn't account for the very real nuances of operational technology networks. And as you all know, it's really a night and day comparison. Like, they couldn't be more different in terms of their design, in terms of their use, their maintenance, and of course, how to secure them. The biggest challenge I hear from talking with owners and operators of these networks, and granted, these are largely not security folks, right? It's not like water utility or a manufacturing plant in the Midwest has like a team of OT security ninjas who are ready to attack this problem, around the clock. The biggest issue I hear from them is, I keep getting all these CVEs, all this vulnerability information,
Right.
and the CIO or the CISO is just telling me to patch it. And I obviously cannot do that because I got a business that is required to be up 99.9999% of the time. And anytime we have this type of conversation, we have to consider the collateral effects, to use a military term, one of which is the burden that would be put on the owners and operators of this infrastructure in order to patch and upgrade their systems. I can tell you from so that's a little bit of kind of my operational planning hat and CISO hat. I can tell you, my time at Clarity worked very closely with the industrial automation vendors themselves, the OEMs, and I'll tell you, it's a competitive landscape, but it's a very kind of communal landscape in terms of the level of cooperation that occurs between the vendors with respect to sharing information on vulnerabilities and making sure that those vulnerabilities are disclosed properly and safely, and remediations can be put out in a manner that's actually digestible by owners and operators. And I think that needs to be a really important part of this conversation without weighing into the policy debate. To get to the answer, you really have to consider the nuances of the operational technology landscape, which is far different than IT. Think SolarWinds, but on a scale, on a similar scale with a smaller number of vendors, where you can't afford to patch, right? That's a pretty risky scenario.
Yeah. So V8, what about that? So I think one of Dave's points, I think, and I don't know if this is, Dave, what you're getting at, but we start using these capabilities. Let's say we're engaged in defend forward, and there's always the possibility that if we get too aggressive in those efforts, right, we're exploiting potentially a zero-day vulnerability or whatever. And if you really can't patch, right, and now this code is out there in the open, right, you've now created vulnerabilities unintentionally in your own critical infrastructure that can't be remediated easily. Is that the right concern to be thinking about? Or is that the wrong concern? And if that's the wrong concern, what increased risks might we see from sort of treating the ICS environment just like it's an IT environment and adopting similar approaches to deterrence?
Who's that for?
That was for V8. Sorry.
Hey, sorry, I think I lost a little bit of that.
There you are. Oh yeah, you're down a little bit.
Right.
So did you catch my question?
Yeah, I think I got the gist of it. Treating ICS versus IT and the dangers involved, right? And I think in general, I 100% agree with Dave on this point that you cannot view the ICS network as the same as an IT network. The threats are fundamentally different in how they move about the networks. That being said, the overlap is still one of the key infill vectors. If we look at all of the major the major ICS OT malwares that are public recently, we have Crash Override, we have Black Energy 2/Havex. A lot of them have been used. What's interesting here is their payloads are very much tailored to the human-machine interface or the PLC controllers. This is unique and different, right? And so I think this is kind of what we're really talking about here, is where the code is actually fundamentally different and it's being targeted towards the unique aspects of the OT ICS SCADA infrastructure. I'll tell you that I think it's the right question to think about. That being said, it's actively being exploited and we're seeing new malware variants that are starting to put payloads in. It's small enough because fundamentally ICS machine, or the components of an ICS network generally have a completely different programming. They're ladder logic based. They're not traditional, Windows based, but they're controlled by usually Windows based machines. It doesn't absolve us of the need to engage on all fronts, at the very least, to be aware of it. Now, if we uncover the right vulnerabilities, I 100% agree. It's going to be hard to patch things that are extremely distributed in remote environments, etc. That being said, to Neil's earlier point, the sharing, the data and the way in which it's shared, how it's made actionable, could potentially be improved. I think CISA has come a very long way since its inception, and I've seen a lot of very useful reports coming out of it. Going the next step for ICS and with the sharing groups, maybe there's tools that can also be presented as part of this strategy where anything that's uncovered, we have the inoculation, and it's not just a report, it's something that they can action, that we're willing to take. That's just an interesting thought forward. So the one thing I will also kind of point out, though, to Dave's point, is this is a problem that's been solved before. You have to have a lot of resources. There's a major oil producer out there that has seen the gamut publicly of public defacement, IT attacks, ICS attacks, IT/OT
Who could it
attacks,
be?
right? And it took a 3-year journey for them. And there's a great McKinsey article that talks about that, how they've been able to pull this all together and treat them as one from a risk management standpoint and risk mitigation action standpoint. And I think the similar kind of concept would apply here in terms of how we would defend forward, or how we would look at this attack surface per se, or defense surface, it is collective, and we have to be very careful on where the red lines are. Maybe a little bit closer in when it comes to OT, maybe slightly further out when it comes to IT, and somewhere in the middle where they're blended. I'm not sure, but it's happened on the public sector side publicly, and I think it's something we can absolutely do, or should absolutely do, as long as we can make it actionable, to Neil's point.
So Neil, looks like everybody agrees with you that it's critical that on the defensive side that the government do a much better job getting actionable data out to the private sector, and that and sort of really stop talking about information sharing alone, and really talk about how to create action and create the ability to not just share information, but to collaborate over that information, in the defensive space. But what about on the sort of the more edgy sort of offensive side, right? One of the things you were talking about earlier, to V8 and Dave's point, is about this idea of deterrence, right? And how we might deter the enemy, right? In your mind, is persistent engagement, defend forward, is it working in the IT space? And knowing that whether it is or it isn't, can we translate that to the OT space, addressing the concerns that Dave and V8 have both raised about just making such an overlay? Is it the way to go? Is it not the way to go? What's your insight? I mean, you've served at the most senior levels, really shaping the governance policy. And so tell us how the administration should think about this as they're looking forward, and trying to figure out what they should let General Nakasone do, both as director of NSA, but also as commander of U.S. Cyber Command.
Jamil, you never cease to amaze me with what seems like a simple question that is actually at the heart of really meaty discussion, right? So I will answer it, but first I want to go back to something Vishal said, and Dave, about the actionable intelligence, which is, I think that DHS and CISA is doing a good job, as is NSA, right, around sharing the intent piece. And one thing we've talked a lot about the threat, but we haven't mentioned it specifically, which is there's a person on the other end, right? It's not, there's a person with a goal and an objective. And understanding what their goal and objective is a more helpful way to think about how to then take that deterrence or that remediation step. And to Dave's point, I think the more that's shared about what the intent is actively with the private sector, the more you're going to get a collaborative solution, because it is so different. So spend time with the experts saying, here's what they're trying to achieve. If you were trying to avoid that, what could you do? And make it more of a discussion back and forth around intent and goals, et cetera. Okay, so that piece said.
Can we just pause there for a second? Because the government, as you know, the government hates doing that, right? I mean, that gets into, the government always feels like that gets into sources and methods, because now it demonstrates that we have some knowledge. I haven't
revealed how I found that out. I haven't revealed my source. I don't have to tell you my method of determining that information. I don't even have to tell you who I believe is doing it. All you need to share, though, is what is their goal, and what is their intent, and how do you think they're going to try to do this? I don't need your sources and methods, but I do need some really helpful insight so we can have a discussion about the best way to mitigate that. And that is my biggest complaint, when people quickly say, oh, sources and methods. I respect that, but I haven't asked you for that. I've asked you for what is their intent and what is their goal. Don't tell me how you found that. Just tell me what it is. Two different things. I'll get off my soapbox on that one.
No, it's an important point, though. It's a really important point because that is the answer that you always hear from the government. Oh, sources and methods, we can't do it, right? I mean, everyone wants to talk about sharing real, actionable information, then nobody ever does it because, oh, sources and methods.
Yeah, I have to tell you, as a private sector company, I find it interesting personally who's doing it, but at the end of the day, I don't need to know that it's this person sitting in this building in this province or this country. Tell me what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and why it matters to my bottom line.
Why it matters, right? Why am I at risk, which does impact my bottom line? So let's have a risk discussion that talks about its impact to my bottom line. So why I'm at risk, or why should I care?
Yeah,
right.
Makes sense.
But back to the bigger piece on kind of constant engagement, right? I will say, I think that awareness and engagement and understanding is helpful. But I think from a policy standpoint, you start to see two reactions, right? So the question is, are we going to see a unification of the internet, or are we going to see a bifurcation of the internet? And what impact does that have on us? And by constant engagement, are we accelerating a bifurcation of the internet, right? So are we in fact, be careful what you ask for because you just may get it, right? On that piece, I do think that we have chosen to engage in a good way. I commend administrations for calling out the actions that have been seen, right? So publicly, we've now seen the FBI talk about the number of cases they open up on a daily basis against China. We are talking finally about the Russian threat, right? So, which we've seen again for years. So what's old is new again. I find it really interesting in the ICS and OT world that we're willing to talk about the threat as it exists to the private sector, but we haven't talked about general consumers, right? So you look, we have talked about China as it relates to Huawei, right, and 5G. But, there's a company, and I'm not sure I'm gonna say the name right, but Trua, that is a Chinese company that is working on control systems and light bulbs, camera, very traditionally based, consumer-based IoT. And if you listen to industry experts, they are entering the market at a loss to gain market share. And so I would ask a lot of questions. Why is that? What is the goal? Are we going to address the threat not only from critical infrastructure, but also from a consumer base? And so when you start to ask those questions, the reason I went there is engagement gets to be a really big discussion. So constant engagement where? Constant engagement around what aspects? When is it engagement around everything? Right? And it gets to be a much bigger discussion than simply engagement to prevent attacks against our critical infrastructure sector or to prevent attacks against our nation state interests, meaning the US. Someone talked before about private sector only sees to the end of their network. And I look at that a little differently and I say, okay, but where does their network begin and other government responsibility, where does one end and the other begin? And if you ask someone to point to the end of your network, like that whole concept physically doesn't translate, right? So does it end at the end of your building? Is it on the light post? Like where does your perimeter end and the other begin? And that becomes a really tough concept in a digital environment.
Yeah. Hey, Jamil, can I pick up on something Neil said?
Yeah, please, David.
I think it's a really important point on the threat intelligence piece and this notion of adversary intent and what they're trying to do. Because if we take a step back and we've acknowledged that, the vast majority of OT and ICS systems are privately owned and operated, they're the ones protecting them. The most kind of sophisticated organizations from an IT perspective are still very early on in their OT security journey. So they're thinking about, not maturity in terms of, how they measure themselves on an IT perspective per se, but around like, how do we reduce risk in the most efficient way possible? Where can I invest in order to actually reduce risk? And that risk is largely measured in business interruption and downtime and reputational damage. And having that adversary intent with enough information, this is where it gets a little tricky with sources and methods, to translate that into operational decisions. Should I invest in network segmentation? Should I lock down remote access? Do I need to develop a baseline of all my OT traffic? That's the type of intelligence that's really useful for private industry right now, because it helps them not, get from 1 to 3 necessarily on the maturity scale, but it helps them markedly reduce risk in the areas that matter most at a time when the threat landscape is increasing. So I think I just wanted to foot stomp that point. I think it's really important when you talk about the opportunity for public-private partnerships going beyond just information sharing. There's not really an analog from my perspective to like automated indicator sharing that happens on the IT side, right? Like that's great, but it's not immediately.
Well, I'm not sure there should be either, right? Not sure anybody thinks that's working pretty effectively. Let's be honest.
So it from a conceptual standpoint, it makes sense, but let's translate that to the OT environment so that operators can actually use the information and reduce risk to their organization.
Yeah, so V8, how about that? I mean, you're out there looking at the stuff day to day, ensuring some of this stuff, right? How do you see the potential for vulnerabilities in this space? How are you ensuring against the risk? How do you think about that? And do you think, as Dave and Neil point out, that there's an opportunity here for the government to do more to reduce the risk that your clients are seeing out there and the risk that you've got to insure? And if so, is it the kind of thing that they're talking about here, going beyond sort of the standard set of indicators? And by the way, look, I think sharing information is critical, right? But we've got to get beyond, hey, here's the things I know about that are bad, right? Just so you know, and by the way, I realize you got this 10 days ago already for somebody else, right? We got to get to the good stuff and not just the stuff we know about, the stuff that might indicate a potential threat. So V8, thoughts on that?
Yeah, both Dave and Neil brought up a great point, which is the handoff between the private sector and the government sector needs to be better defined and more actionable, but done in a manner that's cooperative. And the government has done this multiple ways for the private sector across the globe, right? And especially, I can give you 2 examples for the US and the UK. In the US, as it relates to insurance, it's changing behavior, right? And flood insurance is actually something that's really hard to place because it's not a good risk generally, because there's only a few places in low-lying areas. You're going to get hit if it happens. It all goes. So what the government did was backstop it with the National Flood Insurance Program, now part of FEMA, right? But it essentially backstops insurers to allow them to provide flood insurance to folks. Separately, we saw this it's a company called Pool Re in the United Kingdom, backstopped by the UK government, where it's for terrorism insurance, right? And so they came together and helped companies navigate these concerns. And should insurers have a catastrophic loss, the government was there to help them through those rough periods. Now, not advocating for any of that right now for cyber necessarily, but as we talk about ICS and SCADA, Dave brought up a great point. It's at the early days of defense maturity as it relates to OT. It's nowhere near. IT has had a decade in the sunlight. OT is now coming online as a darling, and I think there's a really unique opportunity here for the government to take the lessons learned from the past decade and use these incentives, use where their network ends and our responsibility begins, and becomes an us discussion around behavioral change, actionability with financial incentive, not necessarily incentive, but financial backstop, so that there is a reward for making these happen. And frankly, the government is the right avenue to provide this level of sophistication, this level of support. And I think we could do more for sure.
Yeah. So we've got about 7 minutes left before we're done for the day. So I want to go to each of you and sort of lay out for us what you think the right approach to sort of effectuating deterrence in this space is in your mind. If you own the pen, if you were, and again, who knows today who really has the authority, right? Given all the different titles that are proliferating, but somewhere between, if you had the ears of Jen Easterly, if she gets confirmed at CISA, or Chris Inglis, if he gets confirmed as National Cyber Director, or Ann Newbarger as Deputy National Security Advisor, or Rob Joyce at CSD at NSA, if you had them all sit in a room, right, or Jake Sullivan for that matter, the National Security Advisor, right, and you had the opportunity to say, look, you've got to focus on the threats in the ICS space, and I would have you take the following 2 actions, right, to better defend and or better deter enemy action, right? What would that look like? So, Neil, I'll go to you first, since you've actually sat in that room and made those calls. What would you, if you had their ear, what would you say to them today?
I'd say a couple things, right? As you know, we spent a lot of time on this, and it crossed administration. So this isn't a partisan take that I'm about to share. I mean, we came up with the CNCI in the Bush administration. It was reaffirmed and implemented in the Obama administration. And I would argue further during Trump, and you now have the right people in place to take it to the next step. So one of my first things would be finally have the discussion around who does what and make it clear. And so we have a tendency to pass new pieces of legislation where we give new authorities, but we never tell someone to stop doing something. So everyone comes to the table with their list of authorities that they've had for years. And so I would say have the tough discussions. You have enough people with past history in the right organizations to end the fights and once and for all decide who has what responsibility.
All right.
On that front, I'd also say, look at what you already have. So if I look at all the pieces of new legislation that are being proposed, and they're all valid, I look at it and say, that's great. Are you enforcing the existing pieces of legislation that do exactly what you're proposing? So I'll give you my favorite example is NetGuard. So Senator Wyden had it added into the Homeland Security Act under Title II as part of the cyber piece, which was a cyber act within the Homeland Security Act. It created NetGuard, which is a collection of reservists there to help and assist the government in a cyber incident. Okay. And every few years, we've seen new pieces of legislation to do essentially that, instead of holding departments and agencies accountable for implementing the legislation that exists. And so my second piece of advice to that team would be, don't look for new legislation, utilize the pieces you have in place today.
Right. All right. So fix the bubble chart, right? And no new laws necessary. I actually think the administration will like that, right? Like do what's in your own authority already. Don't worry about Congress and all the stuff over there. So I think those are really those are things that they'll really be interested in. All right. So Dave, over to you. If you had the ear of the decision makers in the White House and the various agencies, I don't mean to leave out FBI and Secret Service play a critically important role in the space. I certainly don't mean to, so the head of NCI JTF, the head of the Cyber Division of FBI, the head of the folks that do it at US at Secret Services Cyber Division, also critically important players in this space too, and obviously the folks at DNI and without a doubt across DoD. But Dave, thoughts?
So I'll still steer clear of like specific policy prescriptions, but I'll say this: the reason a deterrent strategy is necessary in the first place is that a resourced, willing, capable state-sponsored actor will be able to access and ultimately achieve their desired effect in the ICS space, right? So therefore,
DNI told us that very clearly.
There's no kind of network security or cybersecurity mitigation there. The reality is, for deterrent strategy to be palatable and executable at the national level, you need to decrease the pool of actors that it applies to. And right now, quite frankly, we aren't doing enough blocking and tackling in order to raise the barriers to entry for those sub-state sponsored actors. And I think, I say that to kind of elevate this notion that a national deterrence strategy or deterrence in general goes hand in hand with what industry is doing to actually protect their networks and make it at least less economical for, criminal organizations or other non-state actors to gain access to these systems. I go back to the water utility attack in Oldsmar, right? So we need to kind of decrease the pool of actors that a deterrent strategy is necessary, I think, for it to be executable. And the way to do that is to raise the game across the board, make it harder, more costly for actors to access these networks, and ultimately be able to attribute their actions, right? So applying a lot of the steps, I'm breaking my own rule here and saying that we need to apply kind of the principles that we've applied on the IT side to the OT side, but the tactics are entirely different, and we need to be mindful of that.
Right. So from Dave, V8, this idea that we need to up the game at the lower levels, then have a real serious deterrent strategy at the national level, and you got to collaborate with the private sector if you're going to achieve one or both of those. So V8, you get the last word. If you had the ear of decision makers, what would you tell them on this ICS defend forward issue?
I'd tie together exactly what Neil and Dave just said, and I'd make it clear and actionable. Number one, defend forward. The first time I read about it was a Foreign Affairs article two years ago, but it was beautiful to read. These are things that we've been talking about cyber operations, and people know that cyber operations have been going on for years, but nobody ever talked about it. So getting to clarity and getting it out there. I mean, part of deterrence is people have to be aware so that they can take a step back.
Right.
So let's be clear about it, and then let's talk about it in the right OPSEC environment or the right OPSEC ways, but get it out there and do it clearly. I think that is probably one of the most important things I could say as they figure out all the other items that they need. Be clear about it and get it out there. Number two is have it be actionable. I loved actually what Neil said about having a reserve force or some type of resource that the government, whether it's military or not, is there to provide that backstop. So it's not even just clarity to others, but also to our own citizens, our own companies, that we are here, we are doing something. And then separately, there's action behind it, whatever that may mean, resources, not just intel reports, but something that's credible to drive better outcomes.
Hey, Jamil, add into what Vishal just said. I think really important point, and one that has been missed up until now, really is the communication. And for the first time, talking about cyber, not only I talked about in the language of business, but also in these meaty policy discussions. So people are hesitant to talk about cyber. You are, the kind of cyber nerd, or the cyber article is over here, but the national security or, transnational threats discussion are the cooler pieces. And so I guess my big piece to, this incoming team would be, make cyber cool again. And sort of let's talk about it, but let's talk about it in a way that is accessible depending on who you are. So let's have a policy discussion at a policy discussion level instead of quickly diving to technical. And let's talk about publicly what we know. In this environment, we've been really hesitant to talk about the threat, to talk about the implications, to talk about it at all. And so I think, Vishal, to your point, communication will be clear. And communication on what we're doing, why we're doing it, and back to deterrence, you can't deter what you don't know. And that relates to the red line piece.
Yeah. Well, look, I think this is a great place to end. Thank you to V8 and Dave and Neil for all your thoughts on this. I love that we're ending on the idea of talking about cyber and really getting it out there, right? Making clear what our views are on it, talking about making things actionable. And to Neil's point, making cyber cool again and bringing the nerds and the policy folks together, which is exactly what Hack the Capital is all about, which is why NSI and R Street and Cyber Bytes and ICS Village are all here. And so let me just hand it back over to the man who makes cyber cool again, Bryson Bort. Back over to you.
I don't know if I make it cool,